You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the columnist at the I newspaper, Ian Dunt, and the political editor at The Sun on Sunday, Kate Ferguson. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, the front of the Financial Times looks at the UK government's energy plans with the headline, Renewables Groups Face Price Caps. The Eye says Liz Truss has had fraught disagreements with Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg over how to prevent energy blackouts this winter. Number 10, hit by row over Brexit freedoms, reads the front of the Daily Express, as they look at another alleged cabinet rift. The Star looks at panic buyers who were stockpiling candles over fears of a blackout this winter. On the Telegraph's front page is the sacking of Tory Minister Conor Burns, who has had the whip removed over claims of serious misconduct. This is also the story on the front of The Guardian. The Times says parents could be directly handed cash payouts, with Liz Truss looking at overhauling the childcare system. The Daily Mail leads with a prescription soup and shakes diet, which is set to be offered on the NHS, claiming to reverse type 2 diabetes. But the Mirror says the NHS is suffering from a booster jab crisis, with millions of over 50s yet to receive their booster as COVID cases begin to rise again. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by columnist at the I newspaper, Ian Dunt, and political editor at The Sun on Sunday, Kate Ferguson. Welcome to you both. Let us start with the front page of the Telegraph and their headline, Minister sacked. Conor Burns stripped of whip over serious misconduct claims. Take us into this story, Ian.
Yeah, so this makes the front page of several papers. You'll notice, even though she's only been in power, really, for about a month, most of which was taken up by the death of the Queen, and even though she's only just ended the Conservative Party conference and should have a period of calm before Parliament starts up next week, the front pages right now are like the last days of Rome for the Conservative Party. It's an absolute nightmare. Sort of cabinet rift after cabinet rift after cabinet rift and scandal. This one falls in the scandal category over events that took place. Can't tell any details from the coverage so far during the Tory Party conference. Very much of the sort that we saw, during the very long, slow end of the Johnson administration. She has acted much faster than Johnson. Truss has stripped him of the whip very, very quickly. So now you sort of look to it as essentially an assessment of, well, is there going to be a by-election there? Because if so, the Tories are probably going to lose. There's only a 10,000 majority, would be considered perfectly substantial most of the time, but given the state of the party right now, you wouldn't hedge any bets on them. So just another really poisonous, toxic story to add to the pile of poisonous, toxic stories that Liz Truss faces on the front pages of the newspaper this evening.
And Kate, Conor Burns has promised to clear his name, expressing shock that he hasn't been given details of the claim against him.
Yeah, this was a story we broke earlier today on the Sun's website, actually. Conor Burns, a newly appointed Trade Minister, been suspended from the Parliamentary Tory Party and sacked as a government minister over this claim of serious misconduct, alleged to have happened at the Tory Party conference at the busy hotel bar. Now, we don't know much about the allegations, so there's no point speculating about the precise details, but it's important to note that Conor has said he thinks he's innocent of any wrongdoing and he's vowing to clear his name. But it is true, isn't it, that this is yet another blow for the Liz Truss regime. It's only in its infancy. It's only 4 weeks ago she was crowned Tory leader and our Prime Minister. But already we've seen cabinet rifts over things, people openly briefing against Liz, and now the sort of now a scandal about the behaviour of one of her front benchers, which is never a good place for a government to be in.
And Ian, The Guardian reminds us that Conor Burns is the 6th Conservative MP to have had the whip withdrawn or to have quit politics in the past 18 months over allegations of misconduct.
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, the numbers go further than that if you look across the parliament. I mean, this parliament, I don't think we're recognising it quite as it happens, because we live in a very high sort of volatility of news and have done for the last few years now. But actually, the degree of of allegations of sleaze and behaviour is really quite severe and happening at an alarming rate, to the point where you really start having to ask questions about the culture. And of course, look, at party conferences, there's a lot of alcohol. The events go on very late into the night. Anyone that's attended will sort of say, these things, people are still going home 3, 4 in the morning. There's a lot of political types who are all together finally and having rather too good a time. And so typically speaking, you get events like this, but most of the time when people are in Parliament, MPs and ministers have a lot of people under them. They have little private offices, which are essentially their own sort of SME, their own small business, where they can do pretty much what they like and behave that they want. So when you get allegations like this, the reason that they're taken very seriously is because in their day-to-day life, they do have a lot of people around them who are potentially vulnerable to their behaviour.
Let's move on to the Eye, your paper, Ian. But Kate, if you take us into this story about rifts in the Cabinet in terms of the handling of the energy crisis, and namely between the Prime Minister and Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Yeah, well, it wasn't so long ago that stories of cabinet rifts would have been quite rare, but now they seem to a penny, to be honest. This is the follow-up to a story that's been rumbling on for a couple of days now. Liz Truss has blocked this big campaign Jacob Rees-Mogg, her business secretary, wanted to do. So the government were looking at whether or not to launch a PR blitz this winter to urge Brits to cut back on their energy use, turn the thermostat down a little bit, turn radiators off in rooms that you're not using. Jacob Rees-Mogg, the business secretary, was apparently in favour of this, but it seems to have been killed by Liz Truss, who thinks it would be too nannying. Now, it's funny because if you know Jacob, he's not a particularly nanny state Tory. So for one of his proposals to be dismissed as nanny statism is really quite something. I think that the issue they were probably weighing, or that they were weighing up back in Downing Street, was, do you need to do this PR campaign? Would it be useful? Or, importantly, could it actually backfire? Because if you tell people to cut back on their energy use, to turn down the thermostat, then there is a risk, isn't there, that elderly people, vulnerable people, might take that advice a little bit too far and could end up putting their own health at risk. And I think that was the concern in Downing Street. So that may have played into it too. But I think more broadly what this speaks to is this sort of extraordinary political time we're living in, where a newly crowned Prime Minister, who should be commanding the loyalty and authority of her parliamentary party and her cabinet, is being pretty openly briefed against by even quite close allies. Remember, Jacob backed Liz for leader and was one of her most vocal backers.
Yes, that is an interesting point, Ian, isn't it? I mean, the Prime Minister's reasoning is that they don't want to be a nanny state and they don't want to tell people what to do.
Well, I mean, the nanny state argument is just one of the most absurd things I've heard in weeks, even from her. I mean, it's not nanny statism because you're not telling people what to do. You're offering advice. And you're doing it on the basis of both people's personal interests of paying less money for the energy, but also the national interest. Like, we're in a period, she likes to talk a lot about Putin, but this is actually one of those moments where you can legitimately talk about Putin. We don't know the way that he's going to behave over this winter. We don't know what the effects of the cold snap is. The basic responsibility of government is to be able to put out messages to people, helping them with the kind of decisions they can do in the national and in their personal interest. To not be able to see the gap between that and debates about, sugary drinks or something, it indicates either that people just don't understand what words are, or that their brains just aren't even understanding the concept that they're being met with. So the arguments she's putting forward are really very, very odd indeed. But I agree that the most interesting thing that's going on here is just the level of internecine cabinet counter-briefings. Like, I mean, this is the kind of thing, do you remember right at the end of Gordon Brown's period as Prime Minister, it might have got to this point You know, maybe right at the end of Boris Johnson's time, it got to about this point. She's somehow managed to achieve it in a matter of weeks. And that in and of itself is the kind of thing you should call the Guinness Book of Records.
OK, Ian and Kate, we are going to take a break there. Coming up, covering stories, including this on the front of the Telegraph. Biden's nuclear Armageddon warning unwise, says Macron. Stay with us for more. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, columnist at the newspaper, Ian Dunt, and political editor at The Sun, Kate Ferguson. Let us take a look at the Telegraph front page. And this is the story regarding President Biden's Armageddon comment. National security officials really saying to the American people that his comments were not triggered by any new intelligence that Vladimir Putin was preparing to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, because, of course, that is the worry, isn't it, Kate?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard, haven't we, over recent weeks, this mounting fear that Putin might use nuclear weapons in that war. And it seems that Biden today has gone all out and suggested that if he does use those nukes, it will be nuclear Armageddon. Now, it appears that his officials have quickly tried to scramble and sort of reset the record and insist that it's not that the US president knows something we don't know and that we're not on the verge of sort of a global nuclear meltdown. But still, it's very alarming and not really what you want to hear. Interestingly, in this piece, though, it also has some quotes from Zelensky, who I think has done an interview tonight with the BBC. And Zelensky also says, we are very concerned that Putin could use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They think that Putin is starting to lay the ground for the use of nuclear weapons domestically in Russia by preparing his people for it. So it is still a real threat. It's strange, isn't it? There's this phrase that's being used at the moment, use of tactical nuclear weapons by Russia in Ukraine. I think most of us aren't that sure exactly what tactical nuclear weapons are. I think they're basically nuclear weapons that aren't the biggest and baddest and most dangerous in the world. They're slightly smaller versions of nuclear weapons. But either way, incredibly alarming that we're talking about the possible use of them in Europe or indeed anywhere in the world.
Yes, Ian, worth saying that President Biden's comments were off script at an event in New York, and this is exactly what he said. We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't think there's any such thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon.
Yeah, it's not massively helpful. Biden is a good man and he's a good president. The stuff he was doing with cannabis 24 hours ago was really progressive and rational and liberal and terribly sensible. He does, however, have these moments of ad-libbing on tremendously sensitive, dangerous topics. And this is a pretty good example of it. We know what the risk calculation is with Putin. He threatened nuclear weapons right at the beginning of this thing. In that sense, the risk calculation hasn't changed, except that things aren't working for Putin. I think no one really, even in the hearts of it, understands essentially whether he's sane. I mean, really, that's what it comes down to, because only an insane person would use that weapon in this scenario. It won't save him. It will just cause suffering, the likes of which we haven't seen in our lifetime. So really, the risk calculation remains the same, but his threats will become more and more belligerent the more humiliated he is in Ukraine. And right now, day by day, he's getting more and more humiliated. It would just be helpful if the US president wasn't necessarily echoing the message that he was trying to get out there as it was happening.
Ian and Kate, thank you so much for taking us through the papers. We didn't have time to get to the Mirror, just the story about older people not taking their COVID boosters, and that's amid fears of a growing deadly autumn wave of the disease.